Well, hi, everybody. It's Dr. Joel Hunter here with Artemis the Philosophy Cat, broadcasting to you live. And we are going to be talking philosophy today, specifically chapters 9 through 10, which is on consequentialism, and 11 through 12, which is on Kantian ethics. So it's been over a week since I've talked with you, and a lot has happened on my end of things. And just wanted to sort of apologize, first of all, for letting last week slip. Circumstances outside my control, unfortunately. But I think that what I've done in repackaging Quiz 4 to include the material from Quiz 3 from last week is part of Quiz 4, I think is going to be a good way forward. I think it's going to be fair to you. And I want to help you get through those chapters that you have on your reading assignment for last week as well as for this week. So with that said, what I would like to do actually is I'm going to mess around just a bit with the control room. Okay, so good. Well, when folks show up, what I'm going to do is make sure that I turn their audio on, and just sort of reminding myself out loud here, thinking out loud, to do that when folks are able to show up. So what I'm going to do first of all actually is do a little screen share. I want to show you a picture of my my son's broken arm, or X-ray of that he had yesterday. So let's do that, and we'll pull that up. So yeah. Okay, so here's his right arm. Oh dear, the right arm, and he's right-handed, so that was not a good thing. Let me just describe for you what happened here. So this is the humerus. So this is the upper part of the arm, the bone of the upper arm, and this whole thing was out of the socket. So the socket's right here. This whole bone was moved out, so it was totally dislocated. And the fracture was here. It started, if you can kind of see where it's bent right there. So this part, this is the radius, and this is the bone that's on the inner part of your arm. And this whole bit here, this is called the radial neck. This was broken off, and so it was a complete break. It was kind of floating around. And the surgeon, when he went in, he put in this pin. So that's what that L is. There is a pin to hold this in place, because when he put the elbow back into joint, that broken piece of the radius would not stay where it was supposed to stay, and so he had to do a pin. So he's looking at getting this pin out, when the cast comes off. But right now, this was taken yesterday, and you can see, like up in here, he's got actually a lot of room. The swelling has gone down a lot. So, I don't know. We have a orthopedic appointment. What is that? Tomorrow. So we'll get the doctor's take on what's going on here, if things look good, and hopefully all that is hopefully all that's going to be good. And then they may do a recast here just to get this a more comfortable for him. Because one thing that happens is he'll move his arm, obviously not bending up and down, but if he lifts his arm up and down, you can hear a clicking sound, and sometimes. And so we think it might be the end of the pin is hitting the cast. But anyway, that's kind of disconcerting to hear that. But anyway, that has been my life for the past 10 days or so. And just wanted to show you what that looks like and what happened. One thing that might be in our future here is ligament damage. When he fixed the bone and he did the dislocation deal, this was not arthroscopic surgery, so he was not able to examine the ligaments, and that'll have to wait till everything heals, and they'll have to see if he's got ligament damage. So who knows? He might have Tommy John surgery in his future, but I hope not. Anyway, poor guy. He's doing pretty well. He's broken his arm before, actually a worse break, but he's doing pretty well with this one, considering he's back in school and all that good stuff. Well, anyway, so that's the Hunter life in the last 10 days or so. It's been kind of crazy. So anyway, that's This right here is the reason I was not with you basically all of last week. Okay, so let's go back to the let's go back to what we're going to do today. And what I want to do is put up the slides, and hopefully a few folks will be able to come in live. And when they do, I'll make sure that I turn audio on. So the thing we're going to do is go through obviously quiz 2, and then we're going to look at the readings for this week. If you have your book, get your Fundamentals of Ethics book out, and we'll go through. I'll point out page numbers and stuff as we go through the slides, and then I may read from a couple spots. So have your book ready, especially if you have questions that you want to point to from the text, and I'd be glad to work with you on those. Okay, let's go back to the dreaded screen share, and we are going to get the slides rolling here. Okay, folks, so it is week 4, and like I said before, we're combining week 3 and week 4. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the results of quiz 2, and then we're going to move into quiz 4, which is exactly the same as quiz 3. Remember, it's all one quiz now. So that covers consequentialism and Kantian ethics. And then we will have time for Q&A if anyone is live to ask questions or make comments. All right, so let's get on to the autopsy of quiz 2. The good part of the autopsy is that the overall results have improved over quiz 1, and so you went from about a 75 average to an 80 average. So that's great. You all made some adjustments to improve your performance, and so that was good. I was glad to see that. And now I want to get into 5 questions that I wanted to highlight as ones that seem to give folks the most difficulty. And so let's just talk about these one at a time. So let's look at this true-false question here, and kind of surprised that that many of you missed this. Because this was sort of the major contrast in the text in the section on psychological egoism. So let's talk about this. Psychological egoism states that heroism is sometimes, but rarely, done from altruistic motives. Okay, this answer is false. The psychological egoist denies that there's any such thing as altruism, as real altruism. Now, we might call certain acts altruistic, but when it comes to their actual motives, they're not altruistic motives. They are instead self-interested motives. So the psychological egoist is saying that heroism, the motive for acting heroically, is going to be self-interest. It is not going to be other regarding or altruistic. Okay, so this answer is false, and about half of you got this one right. Now I'm selecting just one of the classes. There's I have 2 sections, and so I'm selecting one of the sections. It actually might be a little bit higher than 55%, but still kind of surprising that a significant number of you missed this one. I think, and this is just a speculation here, but my guess is because of the way I worded the sometimes but rarely, it was inviting you to take that option. But remember, psychological egoism, ethical egoism, these are absolutist positions, right? And that means that there is at least one moral rule that is absolute, that cannot be rightly violated. That is, there's no exception to it. And so that makes it kind of easy to figure out whether some claim fits within the ethical theory. Now, this is psychological egoism, so we're talking about a psychological theory, a descriptive theory, and but the same feature holds here, because ethical egoism is built on the psychological egoist position that there's no such thing as altruism. Okay, so let's go on to question 9. Sorry about the smaller size here, but hopefully you'll be able to read this. Suppose you offer someone help, and in so doing, you are doing what you most want to do. Moreover, you enjoy the experience and feel better off as a result of your action. Okay, so notice there's two things going on there, and so far what we've got. You're doing what you most want to do. So desire, you're pursuing your most desired aim. And then, well, when you do that, you're liking it. You enjoy that, and you feel better off. Remember, however, just as a warning, what is the main issue here? What is the main criterion for your motivation? It is self-interest. Okay, let's continue. The psychological egoist argues that the enjoyment that makes you feel better off is a side effect of your action, not a motive for your action. And that is absolutely true. That's what the psychological egoist argues, that your enjoyment, the feelings that you have, the effects on you are merely side effects. They're bonuses. They are not the reason for your action. They're not the motive for your action. And this is covered explicitly on page 98. Number next is 10, and we are still in psychological egoism here. Suppose someone suffers from a guilty conscience for having done something wrong to another person. Psychological egoists claim that this is because the guilt-ridden person actually puts someone else's interest ahead of his or her own. Okay, this is a true-false question, and it also is like the very first question that I put up on there that had to do with the motive for our actions. And here we have the experience of feeling guilt. Now remember, we're talking about feelings here. So if a person feels guilt-ridden, why do they feel that way? Is it because they have put someone else's interests ahead of their own? The psychological egoist claims that's impossible. You never do that. You always have your own interest ahead of others. And so that is, the guilt then follows from something that you believe is in your self-interest that you've nevertheless not lived up to. Let me look with you real quickly in chapter 7. And this is covered, the guilt section is covered on pages 101. Let me see if I got that up. Yeah, page 101. And just read from you the paragraph here. This is really important. And the reason this is important is because oftentimes we associate morality with feelings. And there are emotive theories of ethics. So it's understandable why our intuitions are strong to tie our motives and reasons for acting to the feelings that are produced or that we think will be produced. So it's really sometimes difficult to see these theories that deny that link. Okay, so let's look at page 101 together. And I'm just reading from the middle of the page. Egoists insist that even these people, that is, people who feel guilty for doing or not doing something, are wholly self-interested. There it is. They are opposing injustice in this case in order to make sure that they can sleep well at night, that they can be free of crippling guilt. Having a clean conscience is a benefit, and so such people are acting from self-interested motives. Now, your author goes on from there to point out a problem with this view. But as far as the psychological egoist is concerned, this accurately describes what they say about what's going on with feeling guilt. It's not because you've actually put someone else's interest ahead of your own. It's because you experience a sense of well-being from having done the right thing and avoided doing the wrong thing, and therefore you can sleep better at night. So that's that motive, the self-interested motive then is the clean conscience. Okay, I hope that makes sense. But the main point is, this is related to the altruism. The psychological egoist never believes we are motivated, never believes we are motivated by other regarding interests, by altruism. And so this is directly related to that position. All right, enough about guilt. So question 16. Now we're into ethical egoism, and here's the question. This is our multiple choice question so far. I think this is the first one. Which of the following actions is always immoral according to ethical egoism? Okay, remember what I said about ethical egoism being an absolutist ethical theory. That means there is some exceptionless rule. So all you have to do is identify what that one thing is. What is always immoral according to ethical egoism? And the answer is D, failing to act in a way that maximizes one's self-interest. That's down here. So many of you answered this correctly. This was a multiple answer. So you had actually the opportunity to select more than one. Now, what was interesting about those that selected more than one answer is, again, how our sort of basic moral intuitions, basic moral rules that we kind of take for granted as right and wrong, how those sort of work their way into the theory. It's like we want to rescue the theory from its worst implications. Okay, a couple of you chose ruining the reputation of an enemy. Most of you did not. And that one, we have a sense of, hey, that's going above and beyond. But look at taking advantage of children or other physically and emotionally vulnerable people. Ooh, that sounds inconsiderate. That sounds unkind. That doesn't sound compassionate at all. And so we want to answer that. But ethical egoism does not say that that is always immoral. I'll have something to say about that in a minute. Then stealing from a poor person. Well, wait a minute, stealing from a rich person, maybe that's okay, but stealing from a poor person, surely not. That too shows a profound lack of compassion. That must always be immoral. Not according to the ethical egoist. There's only one thing that's always immoral according to the ethical egoist, and it's failing to act in a way that maximizes your self-interest. Okay, so there's a couple quotes here that are relevant to answering this question. One is the positive quote, so where it states the answer explicitly for D here, and that is on page 106. Whenever you fail to improve your own well-being as best you can, you are behaving immorally. All right? And then the next one is on page 107, facing page, and this is where it takes care of those other possible actions that we would often consider to be immoral, but which the ethical egoist cannot absolutely rule out as immoral. So here's the quote. If people can best improve their well-being by secretly killing political opponents, by stealing from the weak, or humiliating their employees, then ethical egoism imposes a moral duty to do such things. You can't just even be indifferent about them. You are morally required to do them if it best improves your well-being. Okay, so that's one of the kind of unfortunate, disadvantageous implications of this position, ethical egoism. So it's interesting. I think too that in my experience, at least, a lot of people adopt the ethical egoist position as their sort of working moral view, but they are also shy about the implications of it, and so we want to try to rescue things, important moral values like right. Good. Let me come back. So here we are, back to, sorry for the interruption there. You didn't get to see Kat. So I think my point was that because it's sort of a popular position in our individualist society, we want to say the value of the individual and the individual's desires are highest, and so egoism fits nicely into that view. But then it runs up against very common moral intuitions that we have that are not necessarily compatible with, or at least not absolutely compatible with ethical egoism. That we have to do things like say that caring for vulnerable people is well, maybe that's a social good, but it's not required of me. Okay, and we kind of separate those issues. But the ethical egoist position, a strict ethical egoist position, cannot make it absolute that we have to care, that we have to be compassionate, for example. That sometimes being cruel is what you ought to do, is morally required of you. Being cruel to children, being cruel to weak and vulnerable people is required of you sometimes in ethical egoism because such actions may improve your well-being. Okay, I think I've hammered that one enough. So last one I want to cover from the quiz is question 17. The author discusses several ways in which ethical egoism can conflict with our deepest moral beliefs. Select all that apply. Okay. So this is covered on pages 114 through 116, where he lists what these are. And I did not give you all of them, but for example, I didn't put on there that egoists, there's no such thing as moral rights. So any kind of like civil liberty or something like that, egoists have to deny that those things exist. Except conventionally, they're not actually part of the moral fabric of the universe. So I didn't include that one, but I did include about how it violates core moral beliefs, which we've been discussing in the previous question too. And then the point about it making egoism makes my interests all important, but it seems to be arbitrary that it is my interests that are all important. So that was not included in your list of choices, but the ones that are covered here are included in your text, and so the one that does not fit into the answer choices, that is one that does not conflict. Ethical egoism does not conflict with the view that it requires us to sacrifice. It may require us to sacrifice our own self-interest for the benefit of others. No, ethical egoism never requires that. So that one is not one of those problems for ethical egoism. It is not in conflict because that actually is inconsistent with ethical egoism. So that answer choice D does not belong. So you didn't choose that one, or you shouldn't have chosen that one. Okay. So let's then move on to quiz 4. Let me just pop back if I can and see if I can return to our broadcast here. And I'm going to do stopping the screen sharing. I am back and just checking to see if there are any viewers live who want to take some questions or ask some questions, which I would be glad to take about the autopsy. But I'm not seeing anyone ready to ask questions, so I'm going to pop back to the screen share, and let's go on and prep for quiz 4. So let me look at the Q&A and see if there's anything in the list. And do not see. Let me just check this off here. All right. Good. All right. So yeah. Questions in the queue. We have no questions in the queue. Awesome. So back to the screen with our slides. All right. Quiz 4. Here we go. Yeah. All right. So a lot of reading covered for this quiz, but you will have had at least 2 full weeks to complete it. I should say that I had updated quiz 4 to include both consequentialism and Kantian ethics a couple days ago, and so what I did is I extended the due date from this coming Sunday to this coming Monday. So I gave you an extra 24 hours to complete quiz 4. And also, just as a reminder, you have 2 full hours for this one. So that does give you time to look through your book for answers, check your notes, to look things up and just take your time with the questions. So many of the questions you will just want to read carefully. I had one of you had emailed me about this sort of experience you had taking the quiz or the 2 quizzes so far, and you realized that the student realized that the oftentimes your first answer is the right one, and you second guess yourself. And then what happens is when you second guess yourself, it's not necessarily that you are trying to convince yourself that a more appealing answer is the right one. It is that you sort of lose focus on what the question is. Remember, these are depth of knowledge 3 and 4 type questions, and so they require you to pay careful attention to the wording of the question. And so that's what you want to take your time over. Take your time over reading the question, reading the answer choices if it's not a true-false question, so that it's quite clear what is being asked. Like that last one, let me just pop back to this one here. So here, when you're reading this question, the author discusses several ways in which ethical egoism can conflict with our deepest moral beliefs. You have to look at that. That it can conflict with our deepest moral beliefs. Which of these does the author actually discuss? And then when you look at that answer choice D, if you read that carefully, and you've also internalized the sort of basic principles of ethical egoism, then you know that one can't be right. And then as far as the others, you can look in your text to see whether they're right or wrong. And those are explicitly there, so that was not. But anyway, the point being that probably the thing that trips up a lot of students in taking these quizzes is going through it too rapidly. So do take your time, and I just want to commend the student who mentioned this stuff to me in her own experience about where she found herself choosing an answer that she knew was wrong. And I totally get that experience. I know exactly what that's like. Anybody who's taken a standardized test knows exactly what that's like. And it's like you talk yourself out of, or you misread the question or answer choices, and that's what happens. So anyway, take your time. All right, so let's talk about consequentialism first. If consequentialism can be summed up in one thing, it is about results, consequences, right? So it's about whether the end results are desirable or not. And so that's where moral value is to be found. It's in the results of an action. And the common phrase is, a common phrase that people often associate with consequentialism is the ends justify the means. And a lot of people criticize that formulation. That's kind of horrible. That as long as you get the good results, you can do whatever horrible things the means to get there. And so that's sort of the worst spin on that. However, consequentialists don't hold that. Instead, they hold that the ends justify the means if the ends are good enough. And of course, that gets to the question of, well, what's the moral value at stake here? To determine whether the ends are good enough. Okay, so that's part of the formula that your author goes through on page 121 about the process of how you figure out whether an act is optimific, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. Anyway, the definition for consequentialism, he looks at a couple early or alternative definitions that don't quite do the job at the first 2 pages, and then he gets onto the full definition on page 121. Now, a key term, and this is part of the vocabulary challenge in ethical theories, is you have to identify those words that are important to the theory. And sometimes they're like technical words that have a very specific meaning within that theory. So optimific is the key technical word, the jargon word in consequentialism. And optimific is defined, it's in bold on page 120, it's defined, and it just means that an optimific policy, an optimific action is the one that yields the greatest balance of benefits over drawbacks. And that's put loosely, benefits and drawbacks. That's not a value loaded term as much as what is needed for consequentialism, and that's where we talk about the different kinds of consequentialism are derived from the different kinds of values that are seen as intrinsically good and intrinsically bad. For example, maybe it's happiness, right? And so we get into the hedonistic utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, and then maybe it's desire satisfaction. Maybe that's intrinsically good. And then things that are intrinsically bad would be maybe things like pain and suffering. Okay, so the family of theories of consequentialism, there's multiple kinds of consequentialism, and the author focuses on utilitarianism, but the theories as a whole are looking at the results that produce the greatest number or the greatest balance of benefits over drawbacks, where the benefits might be something like happiness or well-being versus things like suffering and faring poorly. Okay, so let me just pop back for just a second. One thing to notice about consequentialism with respect to the ethical theory we were just looking at, which was ethical egoism on your previous quiz, is that it can be easy to confuse these, because on the one hand, ethical egoism is looking at maximizing your well-being or your self-interest, and maximizing your self-interest and that would be producing well-being is understood to be what is the single primary requirement for the ethical theory. That's what you must always do, is maximize your well-being, self-interest. Act only in your self-interest. But that's not what consequentialism says, because consequentialism looks at total well-being or total happiness. Okay, so it's never just the ego. It's never just my happiness, my well-being. I'm looking at maximizing the total well-being or total happiness, and so that includes then others, and that's the sort of key difference there between ethical egoism and consequentialism. Okay, moving on. So, as I said earlier, excuse me, your author focuses on act utilitarianism as the main representative of consequentialism. Utilitarian for the purposes of your text and what we're talking about to understand the basics of consequentialism, you can identify utilitarianism and consequentialism as the same theory. It's fine. Utilitarianism is simply selecting out a particular moral value as intrinsically good, and a moral disvalue as intrinsically bad, and so that would be well-being. Okay, so your act utilitarianism is described on page 122, and so you can look at that. This family member is identified by its intrinsic values, the good being well-being and the bad being faring poorly. So let's take a look at the problems, and not the problems, but how this is not a problem actually. This is a heads up for two true-false questions that are on the quiz that, in my experience, students often get, or the majority of students miss. And that's because you oversimplify what utilitarianism claims. Okay, so the key is to understand that it's the overall balance of happiness that has to be maximized. Okay, so it can't simply be that it's the maximum number of people that are happy. It's not quantity. It also has to take into consideration the quality of that happiness. That's the first misunderstanding, that if you can perform an action or implement a policy that benefits, or that is that makes the greatest number of people happy, that is not sufficient to tell you that that's what you ought to do under utilitarianism, because it's not just the greatest number; it's also the quality or intensity of the happiness that matters. And your author talks about how you could have a policy that benefits, say, 90% of the population in society, but it's a relatively small gain. It's still something that makes you happy, but it's a small thing. But there might be something that helps only 10% of the population. A significant. I mean, that's significantly less than the majority, right? 10%. But it's, in this case, it's doing something to help the poorest 10% of society. The difference is that the benefits there are the intensity is the quality of the happiness that's produced in that smaller population, though, outweighs the happiness that's produced in a larger population for a relatively small benefit. So don't get confused by the quantity of people that are benefited. It has to be the overall balance. Okay. So number two misunderstanding is then then there's the amount of happiness itself. Okay. So your author talks about having gladiator contests or having the Olympics. Okay, so let's have this amazing entertainment where we can beat each other to a pulp, maybe even kill each other, kind of a Running Man thing, and it'd be super, super popular, and people love it. And so there would be a lot of happiness produced if we had the Running Man competition. Gladiator contest or something like that, fights to the death. Who wouldn't turn into that? Well, that the intensity then of the happiness might be amazing, but the Olympic competition, of athletes, this is not the same intensity of happiness that's produced. Okay, but what you have to do in utilitarianism is consider the overall balance. So it's the net benefit. The thing you have to do is not only look at the quantity or intensity of the happiness, but you then have to subtract the quantity and intensity of the suffering, of the faring poorly, over misery. Okay? And so the problem then with the gladiator contest, potentially, or the Running Man contest, is not only the suffering that is imposed on those participating in the event, but even those who watch, who actually do enjoy it, that there can be misery produced as a result of that, and that misery can spread society-wide. So you have to subtract the misery, the unhappiness, from the happiness. All right, so that's the other thing, is you can't just look at the happiness. You can't just say, whoa, policy 1 maximizes happiness. It's amazing. Gladiator contest. No. What about the suffering? Have you taken that into account? Oh, no, I haven't. So you have to subtract that. Okay. So be aware of that. So there are two true-false questions. Both of the answers are false because both of them invite you to have the limited understanding of utilitarianism that does not take into account maximizing the overall balance of happiness over misery. Okay? So, have a close read of pages 122 to 123. And I spent so much time talking about this because it actually helps underscore the importance of optimific as the sort of variable or value that is at stake in utilitarianism or consequentialism. So it helps you grasp that concept better, and also because in previous in classes, students continue to miss this no matter how much I point it out. So I'm just continuing to oversell this point because I really want you to understand it. Don't want you to miss it. All right. Number next. Action versus intention. Right. So what utilitarianism does is it detaches the morality of an action from the morality of an intention. And so you want to look carefully then, pages 125 through 126, because there's a good discussion of that. You can't judge, in utilitarianism, you cannot judge the morality of an action by looking at someone's intentions. The intentions are a separate issue. Yes, they can be praised. Yes, they can be blameworthy, but they do not affect, they do not modify or change the moral value of an action. Okay, so have a look at that. Then next point is the attractions of utilitarianism that your author discusses on pages 126 through 130, sorry, 126 through 130. And one of them I want to point out to you is the very first one he mentions on page 126 is impartiality. And this is a tricky one. This is an attraction of utilitarianism. It makes us impartial in determining the welfare of a person, right? Because every single person under utilitarianism is equally morally valuable. And so that makes then our moral judgments impartial, or it should. Now, your author goes on in the next chapter, in chapter 10, to talk about impartiality then as a weakness also. So it is both an attraction as well as a weakness of utilitarianism. But I think that the author makes a strong case that impartiality overall is a net attraction, a net benefit of the theory. Okay, then the next major part of the text that you need to understand is the scope of the moral community. Who belongs to the moral community? To whom do we owe moral duties? And your author talks about utilitarian Jeremy Bentham, who put down this criteria. Is it those who have the capacity to reason? No. We'll talk about that in Kant. Is it who's a moral agent? In other words, right? Is it those who are is it those who are members of the human species? No, it's not limited to that. It is anyone, any being who can suffer. So that's Bentham's answer to the question. It's not whether they can communicate even, it is can they suffer. If a being suffers, then they are a member of the moral community, and they are people to whom, or individuals to whom, we owe moral duties. Now, let that sink in for a minute, and it will give you some sense of how broad and how broad the moral community is in consequentialism, or at least in most versions of consequentialism. If you take that capacity to suffer as the benchmark for whether one is a member of the moral community. Now, utilitarians will allow that sometimes it's okay to harm members of the moral community, but remember what the principle is: optimific. If you are allowed to harm a member of the moral community, it has to come. So that's a price, right? That's a net disadvantage, and so it has to come then with an overall well-being is in an action or policy that maximizes overall well-being. Okay. So notice here that let's say individuals who suffer debilitating mental or physical disabilities, maybe animals of all up and down the spectrum. Maybe they're all members of the moral community to whom we owe moral duties, and we simply cannot harm them without moral consequence, without it affecting then the overall well-being of the society. Okay, so have a look at this section and the argument from marginal cases. So let's see here. Yeah, the chapter 10 where he goes into the difficulties. We can talk about this briefly. There isn't too much to go over. I mainly want to hit or list for you here the main points, and that is the difficulties for consequentialism are, well, how do you actually measure things like happiness? I talked earlier about the quantity of happiness. Well, how do you actually do that? How we don't have a we don't have a ruler. We don't have a probe with sensors we can hook up to people to measure their happiness. I mean, that's impractical, even if it were possible. So how do we measure it? That is a problem. And there are answers, of course. Utilitarians give you answers to that, so you can look at those for measuring both the quantity and quality of well-being as trying to get over that problem. Okay, so that's the first part. Then the next issue, or the next problem, if you can call it a problem, with utilitarianism is that it is demanding. It is not easy, and in my view, actually, the fact that it is demanding speaks to the plausibility and it's something commendable about the theory. I don't find that any ethical theory that is easy to perform as one that is likely to be true, or likely to be one that produces overall conviviality or welfare. So the fact that it's demanding is a difficulty in the sense of being a utilitarian, a consistent utilitarian. And so it's not easy to do, but the fact that it's demanding sort of speaks to its plausibility, I think. That's my opinion. One of the consequences, though, to its the fact that it is demanding is how it comes to how we act then under its demands. And the thing about the demands of utilitarianism is that it does not allow for any kind of action that is above and beyond the call of duty. In utilitarianism, there's no such thing as, and this is called a supererogatory act. There is no such action that is above and beyond the call of duty. It is in utilitarianism, there are no actions that are above and beyond the call of duty. It simply is the case that no matter how difficult a particular action is, if that is what is required to maximize overall well-being, that's what you do. Okay, so you're not going above and beyond the call of duty. You're doing what's morally required, regardless of whether or not it is difficult. Okay, so one reason that's then a problem or difficulty for consequentialism is that it seems that we want to be able to distinguish between those behaviors that are morally required and those behaviors which are really admirable and praiseworthy, that we would want to say those are sort of models for how one ought to live. Okay, for the utilitarian, we all should be living as those models, and that seems to be asking a lot. It's asking all of us really to sacrifice a lot, and it's not just those who are. There's no moral heroes. We either are all moral heroes or we aren't. So anyway, that is the sort of challenge, and this is interesting too, because it helps clarify what hedonism is. A lot of people take hedonism to be sort of maximizing pleasure. So, and we often take that to be physical pleasures. I'm only going to eat the foods that give me the greatest pleasure. I'm not going to eat my vegetables, right? I'm not going to eat my broccoli. I'm going to eat chocolate ice cream all day long. And we tie then, things like, what I do with my day. How have I spent my day? How do I measure that? How much Netflix did I watch today? How many YouTube videos did I watch? All those things, those are comforts. But the demands of utilitarianism really, take that out of hedonism. And even though hedonists can be utilitarians, the hedonism that's practiced are rarely, in fact, seeking to maximize the pleasures of the body. They are oftentimes seeking to maximize the pleasures of the inner life, of one's psyche, of one's mental life, the intellectual pleasures, for example. And so and those things are often not comfortable, So anyway, went on about that, didn't I? Okay, a next difficulty. I mentioned the impartiality. I'm skipping over that because I'm not counting that this discussion here of impartiality as a difficulty, because I think it weighs more heavily on the side of a benefit. So I skipped over that, and instead we're looking at the problem then of, look, there are no acts that are intrinsically right or wrong. There are intrinsic values. There are things that are intrinsically good in and of themselves for us that produce a good life. But when it comes to actions, when it comes to choices, when it comes to behaviors, we can't say in advance that they are intrinsically right or wrong. Okay, and now we'll get into just a moment the solution of rule consequentialism as opposed to act consequentialism. And one of the benefits of rule consequentialism is that it seems to make room for having intrinsic rightness and wrongness. But that's a side issue. But as far as act utilitarianism is concerned, there is no intrinsic rightness or wrongness. Okay, next, and this is the biggie, is the problem of injustice. So this is where it gets kind of sketchy with utilitarianism, and that the demands of maximizing overall well-being might require us, in certain circumstances, to do actions like exemplary punishment, making an example of somebody, even an innocent person, even a weak or vulnerable person that maybe our moral intuitions are to protect them. It may be in certain circumstances that utilitarianism requires us to perform these horrible acts of punishment, maybe vicarious punishment, where we make someone suffer on behalf of a community, or we make someone an example. And your author goes into, in wartime, this is actually a real problem. How we conduct war, morality of war. And so your author talks about Sherman, talks about World War II, of when this was done. So the problem of injustice then is a serious problem, and your author thinks that is the most serious problem. So he goes into the possible solutions to injustice and talks about those on pages 151 through 154, and you can look at those. There is a question that asks you, to know what are some of the attempted solutions by utilitarians to solve this injustice problem, because they see that as a pretty serious issue, pretty serious flaw, if we can't, reckon with this deep moral intuition that justice or fairness is morally important, maybe absolutely morally important. Okay, so you look at those possible answers, and one of them is rule consequentialism, which then is looking at which rules we live by, and we choose in rule consequentialism or utilitarianism, we choose the optimific social rule, and then there's a discussion of that, pages 154, 155. Okay, boy, I'm losing my voice here. Do I have anything to drink? Oh, I got a little sip of something. Excuse me. All right. So that was a lot about consequentialism, and I hope that was helpful. Fire off any questions. Actually, before we go on to let me pop back into the broadcast and see if there are any questions. If folks are here, hey everybody, let me see who's here with me. Whoops. Dun, dun, dun. Controls. All right. So let me find where my. Sorry, I'm. Okay, that's not right. Okay. No. Okay. Let me see if there's any queue questions have backed up in the queue. No, there are not. Well, hi, whoever you are. I'm glad you're here, and I'm going to cover Kantian ethics here in just a moment. But I wanted to pause from what I've covered, both in the quiz to autopsy and then in discussing consequentialism, to see if you had any questions, and I'd be glad to take them now. But if not, I'm going to pop back over to the rest of our presentation. So here we go. Let's see about Kantian ethics. Now, I appreciate that your author, it makes it kind of awkward to talk about Kantian ethics this way, but your author does not use the technical term for Kantian ethics, which is deontological. It's a deontological theory. That means that it is a theory which looks to our moral duties. So it prioritizes moral duty, and that's what the Kantian ethical theory prioritizes. Deontological prioritizes our moral duties and looks to find to help us. It's a rule-based ethical theory, so it's looking it looks to reason to help us figure out what we ought to do or ought not to do in any given situation. Okay, so let's look at the first couple issues here. There are 4 topics that comprise Kantian ethics that you need to understand that their place in the moral theory. And the first 2 are discussed, fairness and justice, are discussed in Chapter 11. The last 2, autonomy and respect, are discussed, for the most part, in Chapter 12. And so most of the questions that I have for you are going to be coming from Chapter 11. This is the chapter that covers the fairness and justice elements of Kantian ethics. There are questions, I think about 4 or 5, on the autonomy and respect elements of Kantian ethics. But there aren't as many, so I won't have as much to say about those, even though, of course, they are very important. Let's go on then to talk about some of the specific issues in Chapter 11. I want to just sort of run through this list here and sort of highlight particular ones that are on the quiz that you will need to understand and make sure that you look at carefully when you prepare. So, number 1 is discussion of the Kantian theory as one that is rule-based. Okay, and so a very popular and well-known rule-based ethical theory is the one that is shared by many religious traditions, and it's one that the name Golden Rule comes from Christianity in particular, but many religions share basically the same principle, and that is you treat others. This is the rule. You should treat others as you would like to be treated, and it's important here to understand that Kant's principle of universalizability, that's a mouthful, and it's discussed on pages 162 and following, but that principle can sound a lot like the Golden Rule, but it is not the same. And the key difference between them is that the Golden Rule bases the consistency of our moral actions on our desires. And Kant does not think that that is a good basis for determining whether an action is right or wrong or not, or what our moral duty is. And it doesn't take into account as much self-regarding actions. And so it is, in Kant's view, the Golden Rule is not adequate to be a universal moral theory. And so you look at this discussion of how there's some overlap with the Golden Rule, but it is not the same as Kant's principle of universalizability. Okay, and so and now that I've highlighted that phrase, that principle, do have a look at that on page 162. And you have to know, and this is one of the big challenges of the Kantian framework, is you have to be involved a little more in understanding the specific technical language, the vocabulary of Kantian ethics. And so you have terms that are used here, jargon, that is unique, at least so far, to the Kantian view. And what you need to do is look carefully at all of the bolded phrases and terms. So those are ones that you definitely need to understand, and understand how they're related to each other if they are. So I'm listing some of those to bring to your attention, to make sure that you look carefully at them. So the first is the principle of universalizability, and to understand that, you have to understand what a maxim is. And so you look at that, which is on the same page 162. Okay, so what is a maxim? Maxim is simply the principle you give yourself. If you're about to do something, then you're acting on the basis of some principle. Well, what principle have you given yourself for that action? Okay, that is a maxim, whatever that is. It might be something like, at all times be considerate. Never lie. Those kinds of things would be examples of maxims. So that's a principle of action that I give myself, you give yourself, when you are about to do something. Okay? Then we have a discussion, and this is the sort of challenge to universalizability, is what's called the amoralist challenge. Okay, and this is covered then on page 165 and so on. So and further. So the amoralist challenge is going to be the challenge of that morality, ethical theories that require reason, that are based on rationality, are not correct. So the amoralist challenge is described in the form of an argument, essentially, on page 166. So what is an amoralist? Okay, don't confuse the amoralist with the immoralist. So an amoralist is someone who believes that there is an actual right and wrong. Okay, and maybe even absolute. That an amoralist can believe that there is absolutely moral right standards, moral wrong standards, or standards of moral rightness and wrongness. But, and what the amoralist says is, oh yeah, sure, absolute moral rightness and wrongness exist, but I am an exception to those rules. I can pick and choose from the moral rules of right and wrong to suit myself. Okay, so my obedience to the moral rules is optional. That's the amoralist challenge. So the amoralist, and this is the important point, does not deny that there is such a thing as right and wrong, that right and wrong are real. Okay, the immoralist is someone who denies that there is right and wrong, or you could call that a non-moralist. So an amoralist believes there's right and wrong, but doesn't feel that they are required to act on those moral rules. Okay, good. So have a look at that. Then very, very important terms in the Kantian framework are hypothetical and categorical imperatives. Okay, and this is discussed on pages 167, 168. It's also in your glossary. Do have a close look at those. And then lastly, on this page, at least, we have that. Sorry, that what is objectionable about immoral action, about doing immoral things in the Kantian view. And the main objection is that immoral conduct is irrational. Okay, this is discussed on page 166. And this is, by the way, what the amoralist challenges. That okay, so here's the deal. So morality is rational, okay, and if it's rational, then that means it applies to all. It's true for Americans, it's true for Cubans, it's true for Chinese, it's true for everybody. Okay, if morality is rational, because we're rational beings. Okay, it may even be true for, I don't know, dolphins or higher primates. Who knows? But the point being for the Kantian framework is that the moral community is definitely humans, all right? And because we are rational, and we are then responsible for our actions on the basis of that. But immoral conduct is then irrational. And that's what's objectionable about it, is if we act immorally, we are violating our own rational capacities. Okay, we're harming ourselves under this view. Okay, and so that is in particular what is wrong with immoral action, immoral conduct, is that it is self-harmful. We are perhaps lessening our capacity then to perform our moral duties if we are harming ourselves. Okay, if we are constantly making exceptions of ourselves to the moral rules and to our moral duties. Okay, so in the Kantian framework, it's important to understand that the main objection to immoral conduct is that it is irrational, because that strikes at the very heart of what it means to be human. Okay. Now let's go on to the next chapter. There's a section, in chapter 11 where he assesses the principle of universalizability. Do have a look at that, where he talks about the importance that Kant places on integrity. Again, that is what is objectionable about immoral conduct, is that we are ruining our integrity when we act immorally, because we are striking at what makes us human. Okay. Then in the Kantian perspective of chapter 12, we're looking at autonomy and respect. And the key principle in this part of the Kantian framework is the principle of humanity. And this is stated on page 174. Sorry, I didn't put the page number up there. This page 174. And this is where that you are to always treat a human being, yourself included, as an end, never as a mere means. Okay, so in other words, you don't use people. And the Kantian view is that it is never permissible to use people for ulterior motives, for your own purposes, to pursue your own advantage. Sometimes your moral duty is going to be something that is disadvantageous to you. Tough. That's because you have moral duties to others and to yourself. Because if you have to do something that is going to make you unhappy, for example, or that is not going to satisfy your desires, you may have to you may just have to accept that in order to maintain your integrity, in order to remain a whole moral being and a full member of the moral community. Okay, and there's a discussion here about the strong argument against slavery that is built upon this principle of humanity, or that follows from the principle of humanity. If the principle of humanity is true, it is obvious why slavery is immoral and always wrong. That no matter if it might be to my own personal well-being to have a slave, that it is going to be wrong because I am harming another human being. I'm treating them as a means to my end, maybe as a source of pleasure, right? Or a source of economic benefit, and that is wrong because that is using another human being as a means to an end, and that is not permitted according to the principle of humanity. Okay, then this is important because every human being, according to Kant, is the value of the human being is to be found in their autonomy. That every human being is a self-legislator. They are responsible for regulating their own actions. What principles govern their life? You are responsible for that. Okay, so no one else is responsible for the choices you make, the goals you go for, the manner in which you pursue them. You're not a slave to your passions. You can resist temptation. You have your reason gives you power to legislate over your own urges. Okay, no one forces you to act as you do. You are free, and that's part of the key in the Kantian moral universe, is to understand the nature of human freedom. You can choose your own path. So this is what, by the way, this is sort of the Kantian answer to the consequentialist problem of measuring well-being, because you can't put a dollar figure, you can't put a quantity on the value of human life. Why? Because autonomy is what makes us infinitely valuable. We are never means. We are always ends. Ends in and of ourselves. There is however we might objectify another human being, that is never going to be as valuable as the intrinsic value of that human being in and of themselves. Okay? So, this is a really important element of the Kantian framework, so do understand that. This gets into the particular Kantian view of the notion of rights, of where our rights derive from, and how we evaluate rights. Okay. Then number last actually is the concept of the good will, and this is what gives actions their moral worth, and this is sort of the internal part of the performing our moral duty is understanding, and reason is part of this too. We have to know what our duty is, and then we have to have a steady commitment to do our moral duty for its own sake. Okay, and that's, in other words, that is what is valuable in and of itself. It's not because of the results I get from it. It is not because of it, maximizing my self-interest. It is that the duty, the value of doing one's moral duty is valuable in and of itself, and so then that commitment to always pursue that duty for its own sake is what he calls the good will. And that's how we can understand the concept of moral worth. All right, so that's page 178. Have a look at that. All right, and that is the end of the presentation. I know this has probably gone a long time, but I did want to give a sort of full discussion, not quite a lecture, but at least a full overview of these 4 chapters. It's a lot of content, and it's not easy content either. But hopefully, in highlighting these key terms and ideas, that you will find it helpful and sort of inform the reading that you've already done or are in the process of doing, or even rereading, and working them into your own notes and understanding, and preparing for the next quiz 4. So I'm ready to take your questions. So let me pop out then of the screen share and come back to you. Okay. There we are. All right, gang, and really appreciate the chance to meet with you. If you're catching this on the replay, to go over this material with you, and just again to summarize, quiz 2, your performance, excuse me, your performance on that quiz was at a higher level than the first quiz. So congratulations on improving your performance there, and I went through some of those questions that were giving you difficulty in ethical egoism. So do have a look at that autopsy part. And then in talking about the preparation for your next quiz, quiz 4, which is due on Monday, Monday night, 11:59 is the deadline. that we talked about consequentialism and we talked about the Kantian framework. And so hopefully those will be useful to you. And if you have questions about them or about anything about that you had on the quiz, just let me know. I'd be glad to answer your questions. Let me open the Q&A real quick and see if there's any typewritten questions. Okay, I don't see any typewritten questions, and I'm ready to take any questions you have. So I'll get questions then, I guess, from the replay, from those of you who see the replay. And thanks for tuning in, and I hope you didn't mind the little introduction, giving you a little picture of what's been going on here at the Hunter household with my youngest son and his broken arm, dislocated elbow, and working through that this past week. Appreciate your patience in getting back into the swing, for me to get back into the swing of our class, and hopefully this won't prove to be too disruptive to you, and that you'll be right back in the swing of things, and your performance is going to be great on Quiz 4. I know it will. And yeah, so thank you all for tuning in, and I will catch you at a later time. See you by email, and if at any time you want to reach out, just let me know. I'd be glad to speak with you and exchange information by email. All right, thanks for tuning in, and I will see you next week. Take care.